My name is Joan. I'm 70 years old, and I used to think my family would always be my safe place. Every summer, since before my husband passed, we would pack the car and drive up to our cabin by the lake. It was our tradition, our small piece of heaven, surrounded by pines and quiet mornings. I thought this year would be no different, until I saw a photo that made my heart stop. It appeared on my phone one Sunday afternoon. A smiling picture of my son Brian, his wife Amber, and their two kids posing in front of the cabin porch. The same porch my husband built with his own hands. Behind them, the lake shimmered in the background, the sky perfect, everything perfect except for one thing. I wasn't there. I kept scrolling through the photos, each one showing the same thing, the same trip, the same family memories, only without me. At first, I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe they went up early. Maybe there had been a mix-up. But then, I saw Amber's caption. Family time at our favorite place. Finally, some peace and quiet. My throat tightened. I called Brian, my hands trembling. He answered quickly. Too quickly. His voice overly calm. Mom, it was just a glitch with the booking site. The cabin system accidentally double-booked, and we couldn't fit everyone this time. I heard Amber laughing in the background, that soft, filtered laugh that always sounded rehearsed. A glitch. That word echoed in my head long after the call ended. I stared at the photos again, zooming in on the dinner table set for four, the empty chair where I should have been. I tried to believe him, I really did. But something inside me whispered that this wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared so many meals as a family. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, the ones where I was still part of the picture. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, the cabin deck, covered in snow. Slowly, I began to see the pattern. Fewer calls, fewer visits, smaller invitations that never quite included me. I had brushed it off as busy schedules, life happening. But this felt different. It felt like being erased, one family photo at a time. The ache in my chest wasn't just about being left out of a trip. It was about realizing that somewhere along the way, I had become optional in their lives, as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. That night, I sat awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of crickets outside my window. I thought about how easily people can edit others out of their stories now, just like deleting a picture that doesn't fit the frame. I never imagined my own family would do it to me. But as I looked again at the photo, the smiling faces, the lake, the home I built, I knew this was only the beginning. Something had shifted, and I could feel it deep in my bones. This wasn't an accident. This was a warning. The cabin was never just a building to me. It was a dream that Frank and I had whispered about late at night, when the kids were still little, and the mortgage felt like a mountain. We didn't want a big place, just somewhere tucked away by a lake, with a wraparound porch and room to breathe. It took us nearly 10 years of saving before we found the right one. It was a fixer-upper, nothing fancy. But it had good bones and a view that made you forget to speak. Frank fell in love with the waterline. I loved the silence. That first summer, we stripped wallpaper, patched holes, and slept on an air mattress under a ceiling fan that squeaked like it had a voice of its own. Over the years, it became our sacred place. Birthdays, anniversaries, and July 4th, fireworks over the lake. Brian caught his first fish off that dock. I still remember the way he held it up like a trophy, yelling for Frank to come see. Amber came into the picture later, sweet and a little unsure, and we welcomed her like family. Eventually, the cabin became where they celebrated their own milestones. When Frank passed, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. We'd built too much into those walls. I took over the taxes, the insurance, the repairs, quiet things that no one noticed. The deed stayed in my name, not because I wanted control, but because it felt like the last piece of us I could protect. Frank and I had worked so hard to build that life, and I didn't want it lost in paperwork or forgotten in a hand-me-down transfer. As time went on, I stepped back a little, let Brian and Amber host the summer trips. It made them feel grown, responsible. And I liked watching the next generation make their memories. When people referred to it as their cabin, I never corrected them. It seemed like such a small thing to let go. I didn't need credit. I had the memories. The only framed photo on the mantel was one from our first winter there. Frank in his flannel. Me, in that ridiculous knitted hat he loved. The wind had turned my cheeks red, but I remember laughing like I didn't have a care in the world. But lately, something shifted. Amber started decorating the place like it was hers. New curtains, new paint, and even rearranged the furniture without asking. At first, I thought she just wanted to help. Then I heard her call it our investment, in front of friends, as if the place had always been theirs. Still, I stayed quiet. What was the harm, really? Letting them feel proud of something, even if they hadn't built it. That was the role I knew: make space. Don't ruffle feathers. Be the one who keeps peace. But after seeing that photo, the one I wasn't in, the one where they looked so at home without me, I started to wonder. Maybe in trying not to take up space, I disappeared more than I meant to. Maybe by not speaking up, I made it easy for them to forget who planted the roots beneath that cabin floor. It hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted a thank you, but because I thought they knew. I thought they remembered what it cost to build something that lasts. I thought they still saw me, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe I had become just another piece of old furniture they were planning to replace. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I was at the cabin for a quiet weekend alone. Something I hadn't done in a while. Brian thought I was still in town, but I had decided last minute to take a break from the noise. I walked into the living room and heard Amber's voice coming from the porch. She was on the phone, pacing in that tight, deliberate way she did when she was nervous. Her tone was low, clipped. I paused just inside the door, something about her words stopping me cold. She was talking about me, saying things like cognitive decline, early signs, and needing to act before it gets worse. I stood there frozen, listening as she laid out a plan to file for guardianship. My own daughter-in-law was trying to have me declared mentally unfit. It felt like my lungs had stopped working. She spoke so casually, like she was ordering lunch. "They've talked to a lawyer already," she said. They had paperwork drawn up, waiting for the right moment to serve me. The plan was to use the last few months against me, saying I was forgetting appointments, misplacing bills, and becoming paranoid. All things that could be true on any given day when you're 70, but none of them are signs of someone who can't take care of herself. I waited until she hung up, and then made just enough noise in the kitchen to announce my presence. When she walked in, her face turned the color of fresh paper. I asked her straight out if she and Brian were planning to file for guardianship. She didn't deny it. Instead, she told me I was imagining things, that maybe I had misheard her, that it was all a misunderstanding. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. My hands were shaking on the drive home. The betrayal ran deeper than I could explain. I kept replaying her words, the way she talked about me like I was a burden they were preparing to manage. It wasn't just a lie. It was a full-scale operation. My own son was part of it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started writing everything down. Dates, conversations, moments that had felt strange, but I had brushed off. Like when Brian asked casually if I had ever thought about moving into a place with more help, or when Amber offered to take over my bill payments, just to make things easier. I thought back to a week earlier, when I'd received a letter from a retirement home I'd never contacted. It mentioned my upcoming tour and a deposit that had already been made. I had assumed it was a marketing mistake. Now, I wasn't so sure. It all made sense in a way that made my stomach twist. I called my lawyer the next morning. His name was Craig Miller, an old friend of Frank's who had handled our estate years ago. I asked him what I needed to do to protect myself. He listened carefully, then told me the first step was to revoke any power of attorney I might have given, even temporarily. I hadn't remembered signing one, but Craig checked. Apparently, during my knee surgery 2 years back, I had signed over a temporary medical POA to Brian. It had expired long ago, but Craig said that in the wrong hands, even an old document could be twisted. He asked if I had noticed any strange activity on my accounts. I hadn't, but something about the way Amber spoke made me think they weren't just after control, they were after the cabin. That thought turned my fear into something sharper. Anger mixed with clarity. I had let too much slide. I had spent years stepping aside, being polite, making room for them to grow. But now, they were trying to use that space to push me out entirely. A few days later, I met Brian for lunch. I needed to see his face. We sat at a small table by the window, and for a moment, he looked like the boy who used to build pillow forts in my living room. But the moment passed. I asked him plainly if he and Amber were planning to put me in assisted living. He looked surprised, then tired, like the lie was heavier than he expected. He said it was for my safety, that I'd seemed off lately. He mentioned the time I left the stove on and forgot to lock the door at night. I reminded him that the stove incident had been over a year ago, and that the door had jammed, not been left open. He didn't back down, said they just wanted what was best for me, that I'd thank them later. I stared at him, realizing this wasn't about my health. It was about control. About claiming something he didn't earn. I had given him so much, and now he was trying to take the one thing I had left from Frank and me. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just nodded and said I understood. But inside, something shifted. I wasn't going to let them decide how my story ended. I walked out of that restaurant with my head high and my heart steady. Craig had given me options, and now I had a plan. If they wanted to play legal games, they were going to learn what it felt like to lose. I'd built that cabin with love. They were about to learn what happens when you mistake silence for surrender. Craig and I sat across from one another in his office, the blinds drawn halfway, and the sound of a ticking clock the only thing between us. He slid a folder across the desk, neatly labeled in his handwriting. I opened it slowly, half expecting my hands to shake. But they didn't. Inside was everything I needed. The deed to the cabin. In my name. The mortgage history. Blank. The insurance, the taxes, all paid by me. The cabin was mine. It always had been. But what Craig said next made my stomach turn. He had run a title search, just to be thorough, and found a lien filed 6 months ago. Brian had used the cabin as collateral for a business loan, a failing landscaping venture I didn't even know he'd started. He'd forged my signature on the paperwork. Not just one document, but 3. Enough to make it look legitimate. Craig told me we could pursue fraud charges. He laid out the legal path, but I told him I didn't want prison. I wanted peace. I wanted my dignity back. He nodded and began drafting the paperwork. The first thing we did was file to revoke any and all power of attorney, both medical and financial. I signed the forms with steady hands. Next, I signed a listing agreement. The cabin would be sold to a buyer Craig had already vetted, a retired couple from Vermont who'd been dreaming of a lake house for years. They had cash in hand and could close in 3 weeks. We drafted the 30-day notice for Brian and Amber. It was direct, lawful, and final. Craig offered to serve it through a process server, but I said no. I wanted to do it myself. I drove up to the cabin on a Friday afternoon, just before sunset. Brian was outside, hammering a loose board on the porch. Amber stood on the lawn with a glass of wine, talking loudly on the phone. When they saw me pull in, their faces twisted with confusion, then concern. I walked up the steps without a word, handed Brian the envelope, and stood still as he opened it. He read it once, blinked, then read it again. Amber stepped closer, trying to see over his shoulder. Then she snatched the paper and read it aloud. Her voice rose with every word until she was practically shouting. She demanded to know what this was. I told them calmly that it was a notice. The cabin was sold. They had 30 days to leave. Amber's face turned red. She laughed in disbelief and said I couldn't do this. Brian asked if I was serious. I told them I was. I told them the cabin was mine, had always been mine, and now it was going to someone who would treat it with respect. Amber accused me of acting out of spite. She said I was tearing the family apart. I looked at her and said she had done that the moment she tried to erase me. Brian said I was overreacting, that we could work this out, that it was just a misunderstanding. I told him it stopped being a misunderstanding the day he tried to make me disappear. They stood there stunned, grasping for words. I stepped past them, walked into the cabin one last time, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. Everything looked smaller somehow, familiar but faded. I walked through the rooms, touching the edges of tables, the corners of cabinets, as if saying goodbye. On my way out, I paused at the front steps. Brian followed. Quieter now. He asked why I was doing this. I looked him in the eyes and told him the truth. Because you thought I wouldn't. Because you believed that kindness means weakness. Because you counted on me, never standing up for myself. He didn't answer. Just looked away. Amber stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, muttering something about lawyers. I didn't respond. I got in my car and drove back to town. Not with joy, but with clarity. Later that evening, Craig called to confirm the buyers had signed. The closing date was set. The cabin would be theirs in less than a month. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. I felt like something had been restored. Not the cabin. Me. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. A signed paper. A closed door. A moment of finally choosing yourself. They had taken my silence for surrender, but I still knew who I was. And now, so did they. I sat on the porch of my apartment, a cup of coffee warming my hands, watching the morning light filter through the trees. The cabin was gone now. Sold. The papers signed, the keys handed over, the door to that chapter quietly closed. I hadn't driven by it since. I didn't need to. It was no longer about a place. It was about what I chose to hold on to and what I finally let go. Sometimes I still see Frank's face in the shadows of early light. He would have understood. He always did. He used to say, legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about who you are while you're still here. I think about that now more than ever. I didn't fight for wood and stone. I fought for my name, for the truth of what we built together, and the respect that should have never needed a defense. Brian hasn't called since the move. Amber certainly never will. But I'm not angry anymore. There's a strange freedom in not needing closure from people who never cared to give it. I don't miss the silence. I miss the feeling that we were all still on the same side. But I'd rather sit in my own peace than keep pretending for the sake of a harmony built on lies. Then, one afternoon, my granddaughter Lily knocked on the door. She looked older than I remembered. Taller too, with a softness in her face that reminded me of Frank. She didn't say much at first, just hugged me like she meant it. We sat at the kitchen table while I poured her lemonade from the fridge. She took a slow sip, then looked me right in the eye and said, "Thank you." She told me she had seen more than we thought, that she had watched how I was treated, how I stayed quiet, and how I finally stood up. She said watching me gave her permission to speak up in her own life. I showed her what integrity really looks like. I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded, my throat tight with something that felt like both sorrow and pride. When she left, she promised to visit again soon. I watched her walk down the path and felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't a loss, it was a kind of lightness. For the first time in years, I felt like I had passed on something worth more than a house. I had given her the courage to know when enough is enough. Legacy isn't property. It isn't money or titles or old furniture passed down without meaning. It's the truth you leave behind, the kind you protect when no one else will. It's choosing your self-respect even when it costs you comfort. And sometimes, it's knowing when to walk away with your head high and your hands clean. I didn't keep the cabin, but I kept my voice. And somehow, that feels like more than enough.